Well, demonstrations in Baghdad have fought with police during anti-US protests. Police have used tear gas and sound bombs to disperse large crowds. Hundreds of people attempted to march to the US embassy in a show of support for Iran. An Iraqi armed group has targeted a US base in the northern Kurdish region. Aria base is in the city of Erbil, and it's a logistics hub hosting American troops. Some US soldiers that recently pulled out of Syria were stationed there. Pro-Iran group Saraya al-Liwa al-Dam has claimed responsibility, saying the attack was in response to Ali Khamenei's assassination. Okay, let's take this on now from Whitefish in Montana. We can speak to Michael Mulroy. He's a former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. Mr. Mulroy, great to have you with us. How do you see now the trajectory of the war, given that the Supreme Leader is now dead? We're seeing the Iranian missile response happening in earnest right across the region. What's your take on how this is going to unfold immediately?
So, Nick, really it's going to come down to what the Iranians do. I think President Trump, obviously in acknowledging the Supreme Leader was killed, talked about how he had a preference. He didn't name who the person was, who would take over. So I think although the countries, Venezuela and Iran, are very different, I think he's looking at a potential similar scenario in the sense that when he removed Maduro, he looked to his vice president to essentially take over and be more compliant with what the United States wanted to see them do. In this case, I assume he wants to see Iran enter a nuclear agreement under his terms.
Can you see that sort of Venezuelan model? Can you see that Venezuelan model working in Iran? It was a completely different ballgame there, isn't it, to Venezuela?
I agree. I think it is a completely different ballgame, not just on the obvious geography of it, but the regime itself. So the regime in Venezuela was really held together by Maduro with some very weak underlings. In Iran, you had the Supreme Leader, of course, but there were multiple different power centers in the clerical, in the military, in the IRGC, in the intelligence service. They're unlikely to comply with what President Trump has done, and Israel, of course, taken out the Supreme Leader and significantly hitting the nuclear sites, the ballistic missile sites, and the military itself. They're more likely, and everything that they're saying right now, including the recent statements from Laranjani, is that they intend to escalate this and essentially turn the region into an all-out war, causing as much pain, not only to the United States, but also against the Gulf countries in the region.
In terms of the Iranian response, not only against Israel, but also against US assets in the region, as we've been seeing here in Doha, how capable is Iran of muscling this out? Because they do face a formidable force. To what degree can they keep this going? What stockpiles do they have?
So they're believed to have around 2,000 ballistic missiles. And obviously the most important is the ballistic missile launchers, because you can have 20,000 ballistic missiles, so you don't have anything to launch. It's not very effective. So that's where I think they focus. I don't know how far they depleted it, but I imagine the intelligence services are doing those battle damage assessments. But the other issue they have is the Shahed drones, which is what you see striking a lot of these buildings in Dubai, Bahrain, for example. They can mass produce those, and that's how they've been supplying those to the Russians for years. So that's an issue. Of course, they're pretty easy generally to shoot down, but we've seen a lot of them get through. I don't know if that was because they just massed them in the sense that they sent so many, it was hard to deal with them all at once, and that's what it sounds like in the UAE. But that is probably their biggest threat. But they can also do things like target diplomatic facilities around the region, target diplomats themselves, do terrorist attacks, potentially even in the United States. This is an existential threat to their regime. So I don't think they'll stop at anything to defend themselves.
So given what you're saying, what will now, today and in the coming days, be the immediate targets for the US and Israel within Iran? What will they be trying to hit? The ballistic missile launching sites? What else?
So this is where we would probably see the strategic bombers. I mean, generally speaking, in this type of campaign, we'll see the TLAMs, the Tomahawk missiles, shot first. They're, like it sounds, a missile, so they're not manned, and they can take a lot of the air missile defense. systems out, and then you'll start seeing the manned aircraft, so the fighter bombers. And once they have essentially dominated the airspace, then you can bring in these very large but very effective strategic bombers that can drop things like the massive ordnance penetrators on the nuclear facilities to do more damage and degrade them even further. So we might see those next. And that would be, I think, to just continue to degrade these facilities and make sure they never acquire a nuclear bomb through the use of them.
I guess the immediate question is how quickly, or indeed can, the United States and Israel negate Iran's capability to respond in the way that it is at the moment?
So I don't think they'll ever be able to eliminate it, but they can deplete it to the point where it's not the concern that it was obviously before the strikes started. One way to look at this, if you think about the term mow the grass during the global war on terror, it was an acknowledgement, although it might be crude, but it was acknowledgement that you're never really done. So if you look at this in Iran from Israel's perspective, but also the United States, whenever they think the threat level gets so high, in other words, the manufacturing of ballistic missiles and launchers, they strike and they reduce it to a point where it's less of a threat. And that would be the same with the nuclear sites. So this might be something that reoccurs over and over again. I think we should all hope it does not. It's hugely disruptive. But that might be, from a military perspective, the best way of dealing with the threat from Iran.
Mr. Mulray, Donald Trump has called on the Iranian people to rise up, but just how feasible is regime change from afar in the way that Trump is trying to make it happen without boots on the ground?
So it is somewhat risky to call for the uprising. Obviously, the United States, President Trump included, wants to see a regime change. But we saw what the regime is willing to do with the protesters before this attack, and it was brutal oppression. They slaughtered tens of thousands of people. So calling for it to happen, although I can understand why we would want to see the regime changed, is risky, because if they listen to President Trump, then the consequences will at least in part be on him. What can the United States do from the air to facilitate regime change? Well, you can do the decapitation strikes, what we saw, today with Supreme Leader Khomeini and many of his senior officers being killed. But that doesn't necessarily change the regime. That's really going to come from the opposition forces, opposition groups, I should say, on the ground. But they have an issue. They're not armed, and they can be, and we've already seen, targeted specifically by the IRGC Basij force, which is responsible for ensuring that the regime stays from internal revolt, like we're seeing right now.
Right, yeah, the role of the Revolutionary Guard is key in all of this as we enter the coming days. Appreciate that. Michael Mulray, a former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick.